I started this project because I had just finished another one, and I was bored and didn't have anything else to do. I'd been walking by this big board sitting on the workbench for a few weeks. It originally came on a 2-drawer dresser that my parents had. I think my grandparents gave it to them as a wedding gift back in '52. And I remember it being this ugly turquoise looking color that you can see here on the surface. And at one time it was an ugly looking gray, and then finally it was white. But I had it down in my cabin and I was using it, but it was old and had been in the barn in storage for years, and it stunk and smelled. And I finally found a free one on Craigslist that was narrower and taller, so I replaced this. And rather than throw this away, I scrapped out some of the wood. Since it's old wood, it's in pretty good shape. At any rate, I used a paint remover to take most of the paint off. The boards, where they were glued together, had split a little bit, so I had to re-glue a couple of boards. And of course it was warped, like you'd think coming out of a barn several years of storage. So it wasn't flat. I wasn't going to be able to make it flat because I couldn't fit it in a planer. And it wasn't thick enough to plane down to get it flat. It would have ended up 1/8 of an inch thick. So I'd seen another person on YouTube make a video that had little oak rounds in it like this. It kind of flowed across a big expanse of wood. So I thought I'd give it a try. I dug out a bunch of oak rounds that I had. Actually, I had the limbs I hauled back up from the cabin, and then I sliced them off in my bandsaw and made these rounds. And then I thought, how am I ever going to remember where these things go after I laid them out? And so I decided to number them. And then luckily, I photographed them so I could remember where the numbers go. So there's quite a few here. Most of the rounds are oak. The wider ones that look newer, they're a cedar, locally here from Washington. And I just kind of laid them out in what I thought was a neat enough pattern. So then the next step was to trace them out on the wood and then cut that patch of wood out where they were going to fit on my bandsaw. And that took a while because I had to make all those little circular arced cuts, but I finally got it. Then I laid them out here on a piece of plywood with my bird seed sack underneath to keep the epoxy from sticking to the wood. It works pretty good, it just pops right off. And the 2 big wood ends at the end of the runs I cut to match the edges of the tabletop. And then I clamped other epoxy barriers to keep the epoxy from completely running out. And then I put some packing tape down there between the metal and the wood. So basically I had the epoxy all sealed in so it couldn't go anywhere. And it didn't really. I had maybe one leak, but I fixed that pretty quick. So then I mixed up some epoxy. And I decided on black because I was going to make the bottom black so you couldn't see anything. It would just be black, no wood surfaces showing or anything like that. And sometimes you find out that the bottom actually comes out better looking than the top, and you want to switch that. Well, if you've already poured it black, that's kind of hard to do. Not impossible, but harder. So I was mixing up, looks like 16 ounces at a time in my cottage cheese cans here, because you can only pour about 1/4 of an inch with the epoxy that I use without getting yourself in trouble. And then this is the backside. This is after I've started sanding. What really happened here was my oak rounds were not as thick as my tabletop. So there was a big groove running down here where this river flows. And so you have to sand the oak rounds down so that they're flat with each other. So that's your baseline. Now you have to somehow get the surrounding wood down so it doesn't look like a mesa in the Grand Canyon. You want it to more look like a veil. It doesn't matter if there's a little swale there, but that's a heck of a lot of sanding. So I started out with my electric planer, handheld electric planer, and I buffed some of the height off of the boards, but you can't do this softwood with a planer because it'll just get away from you. You'll cut grooves in there, you'll never be able to get out. You'll be chasing your tail for hours. And then I brought out my handheld sander, electric sander, belt sander. And that can get away from you too. It can cut big grooves on the edges if you don't keep that thing moving and back and forth and going along. So that's what I use, and I sanded for quite a while on this thing, mostly on the pine wood that you see there. And I got it so that's just slightly swaled where the epoxy is. I wasn't going to get it level, and I wasn't really concerned about it, but I just wanted to ferret in so that to the eyeball, looking straight on, it looked okay. And this turned out to look okay. So in this picture, I put a stain on it, a light stain. I think this is the Minwax Ipswich pine. I like that stain on oak because it's a very light stain. Doesn't make it real dark. And it kind of pops the grain on that's pine or whatever that softer wood is that the table dresser top was made out of. And the epoxy, I threw some gold glitter that I had left over from another project down there and poured the epoxy over the top of it. You can see in this view I started with black and then I finished with clear on top of the glitter. And then in this view I've started to put the wipe on poly finish on. I've made a little medallion in the upper left corner there. I make that out of brass. I have a brass sheet that I got from my neighbor after he died, and his sister was liquidating everything in his garage. So I've got a lot of brass material. And then if you take and make yourself a decal and cover the brass where you don't want it etched away, and then put the rest of the brass face down in a tub of ferric oxide, you'll eat away that metal. And then when you're done, you peel the decal off, and that's what you have there. Comes out pretty cool. And then you put an antique corrosive chemical on there, and it turns the relief dark. And then you just buff it on a 1000, 1500 grit piece of sandpaper, and it shines up. And then my wife saw this and said, hey, this would make a good clock. I could hang it on the wall in my office. So I laid out a clock over here on the right side. And of course the numbers are the flat-bottomed marbles that you can buy a bag of in the dollar stores. And the hole is there for the clock mechanism. The sides have been cut with my handheld router. And this is probably the first or second coat of wipe-on epoxy. I use a 50-50 polyurethane and mineral spirits mix for that. Here's another view, pretty much the same, but I have got several coats of the wipe-on poly on here now. And I wipe it over everything. I wipe it over the blue marbles and the brass. And here's the finished product. All the finishes on, and I've just put the clock in and pressed the hands on. So it's ready to be mounted. On the back I put a nice wide angled piece of wood back there so you can mount it between the studs of a 2x4s into a wall, because this is pretty good size. You can tell it's 3 feet long and 20 or 21 inches wide there. So it's going to have to mount, take up some wall space. Then I made a matching piece for that slat that's got the bevel on it that goes onto the wall, and then the clock with its bevel bolted to the back or screwed to the back here just sits on that, and you can lift it on and off without having to unscrew anything or unbolt anything. But it was a fun project. It turned out okay. Would I make another one? I don't know. I don't get many big-sized tabletop boards like this. I do have a table that I'm working on that I'm going to cut the center out of and do an epoxy pour. We'll see how that turns out. This turned out okay. The wife was happy with it.